Clearly, European-American affairs, especially our relations with the Soviet Union, are a perennially critical part of our nation's foreign policy. Today, the impact of Mr. Gorbachev, the state of the nuclear balance, issues of alliance, terrorism, and trade, among others, are in the forefront of our reflections. It is an especially interesting time to be joined by the United States Department of State's senior officer with European-Canadian responsibilities, and to hear her choices under the general title, Selected Themes in United States-European Relations. Our guest has served abroad in Manila, Palermo, Oslo, Nassau, Helsinki, and Berlin. She has held the posts of Ecuadorian Desk Officer, Deputy Director for Policy Planning and Coordination in the Bureau of Inter-American Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission in Nassau, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and Fisheries Affairs, Ambassador to Finland, Special Negotiator assigned to the Secretary's staff, and Ambassador to East Germany. She was appointed to her present post in 1982. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Canadian Affairs, Rozanne Ridgway.
I'm very pleased to be here this evening. If it were true that I had been appointed to my present post in 1982, I suspect from what I know now I would not have survived to be here. I have been Assistant Secretary of State for 6 months, perhaps 6 of the most interesting months of this administration, government under the leadership of Ronald Reagan. And the experiences of those 6 months, the themes that emerge are the things I'd like to talk with you about this evening. The beginning of a year is a good time to take stock, to put things in perspective, to step back from the specifics of the day's calendar and to examine somewhat more broadly this relationship that we call the United States and Europe, or the relationship that's bounded by the phrase the United States and Canada. Your invitation to discuss selected themes arrived, in fact, just as I was trying to do that for myself after the past busy months. There's a question period at the end of this. I will be interested to hear from you whether you think these themes are in fact legitimate and sustaining as we try to take a moment in this rare month of no travel to think about what we want to do in the relationship. Let me start with the clearest of them all. One word: democracy. North America and Europe hold the densest concentration of the world's democracies. The values of personal liberty, social pluralism, economic free enterprise, and political democracy are what we are all about. It's why we were founded, it's why we have fought wars, and it's why we, with other sovereign nations in Europe and North America, founded NATO in 1949, an alliance whose strength is the unity of purpose and a commitment to share the burden of defending the values I've mentioned. In the same period, this post-war period, a period that perhaps because of generational change we forget about and the themes emerging from that period tend to get lost, there were other institutions being created. Today they have become the European communities and the OECD. And over the years, as we have seen the importance of giving various shapes and forms to the Atlantic relationship, we've developed a rather intricate but nevertheless effective pattern of transatlantic cooperation. This pattern of cooperation, I would like to say as a bit of a footnote, is not the exclusive preserve of the Atlantic world. Even in today's troubled world, the larger world, democracy is very much alive elsewhere, and it's flourishing in societies as diverse as Costa Rica and India. Encouraging the development of democracy in a developing world, in a changing world, is a legitimate objective, I believe, one that we can share with our partners in Western Europe and Canada. Here in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps our home hemisphere, good way of thinking of it, democratic government is again gaining after a long period of rule by military dictatorships and juntas. The figure that we use, you've perhaps heard it on other occasions, something like over 90% of the people of Latin America now live under governments that are either democratic or in transition to democracy, in contrast to 1/3 only a few years ago. One of the features of democracy is pluralism. It's a fundamental characteristic. It's one of democracy's basic strengths. We take it as a matter of course here in the United States. Perhaps you can tell where I'm going with this. We're somewhat surprised and on occasion distinctly put out when democratic countries who are our allies suggest that alliances are also appropriate places for a little bit of pluralism. Europeans and Canadians, for example, are bound to have different perspectives than Americans on many issues of common concern to all of us. They have different histories, they have different geographies, they have different economic requirements, and it follows different national priorities. We're allied because we know that common broad policies provide greater strength, they give impact, they add to the effectiveness. Excuse me, but the process of arriving at those common policies is one of communication and consultation. And as I say, we have to keep reminding ourselves that in that process of communication and consultation, of reviewing for each other what our national interests are, we do have to put up with a healthy pluralism. I believe that the policies and programs that eventually are agreed to through this process are all the stronger for having been tested and modified by these different perspectives. I think that it gives them a dimension of credibility and endurance that they might not otherwise have. There's an old Hungarian saying, one judges a bird by his feathers, a man by his friends. And I think it's worth saying before we get into the problems of the day that the United States has quality, democratic friends around the world, in Europe and in Canada. Another word I would like to throw out is one that includes all kinds of things, but it generally just goes under international economy. But it's the matter of coordinating economies, finance, trade, commerce. In this area, I think that we can see at present among the United States and its allies, as the Secretary said in London recently, a rather healthy new skepticism about some old solutions which tended to be statist, central, and reflect government control. This isn't just the case in the United States. We're seeing it everywhere. A lot of work being done in Europe today on a subject that's called, for example, structural adjustment, trying to find out what it is that makes economies creak when they needn't creak, and what makes them, in fact, block the presentation of new ideas rather than fostering new ideas. We share with our European allies then an interest in keeping those economies alive and healthy, and I think it's worthwhile once on occasion to remind ourselves that it is not possible to speak of a security dimension, numbers of troops, numbers of tanks, without paying attention to the underlying part of that relationship, which is a sound economic interrelationship. The world today, as we start into '86, is one that I suppose in some respects bewilders me. I have friends in the Department of State who tell me that at Christmas time, after long deliberation and a lot of shopping, their families went out to buy the first family home computer, brought it home, and the 5-year-old daughter had to show the adults in the family how to use it. One inescapable feature of the economic and industrial world that we're looking at today is the contemporary technological revolution. It's the microchip computers, it's advanced telecommunications, and other radical innovations. And as we move from the industrial age to information technologies, we believe that the advantage is going to lie increasingly with societies that permit the free flow of people, of ideas, and of information, and who give that spark then to the creativity that keeps us moving. So those three things that we sometimes forget and the relationships they represent, democracy, alliance, four things, economics, and the challenge of the future that's taken up in the word technology, I think are things worth keeping in mind before one jumps into the details of these relationships on a day-to-day basis. We do have perhaps three priorities that are worth looking at that also emerge from this discussion of broad themes. One is the continuous shaping of a Western consensus to address the challenges that are common to us all. It simply isn't enough to say, NATO was founded in 1949. That's it, folks. Don't need anything else. Don't need any other kind of dialogue. That should take care of it. And furthermore, any subject that comes up now, new as it might be, ought to be fit into the old boxes and into the old institutions. It just, I think, is not ever that easy. And so we need to find ways, as I say, to continuously shape this consensus, frameworks within which to shape it, groupings of like-minded states with which we might deal on specific topics. Another is the conduct of the competitive East-West relationship. And a third is the conduct of an enormous and mutually beneficial and on occasion incredibly aggravating trade relationship with Europe and Canada. And I'm sure if you had a European or Canadian guest standing here, they would also probably use that same formulation, including the incredibly aggravating, to talk about this very, very important relationship. But we need to find a way to conduct this trade relationship so that it becomes freer, and so that we learn to live with the fact that when you're talking of hundreds of billions of dollars of trading relationships, you are always going to have problems on the fringes. And it doesn't serve one well to take each problem and announce that its more or less successful resolution is the measure of the success of the total relationship. Let me start then in discussing these three priorities, perhaps with the U.S.-Soviet relationship. I was saying before we gathered for this formal part of things that I sense at the moment, without a date for the next summit, with perhaps the Soviet Union at the moment and its leadership concentrating more closely on the forthcoming Party Congress, that we are poised to see what in fact might come of the reopened dialogue from Geneva. And it is too soon to say what will be the further development of those areas of agreement and convergence that were described in the joint statement which emerged from Geneva. But what we seek in this relationship, what we were seeking in Geneva is a long-term goal, what we will be seeking in the United States when the Soviet leader comes, Gorbachev comes to the United States for the next summit, is a way to manage the relationship with the Soviet Union in such a way that fundamental differences, which are going to remain, deep and serious differences which are going to remain, do not lead to conflict. That the competition, the differences between the two of us, is conducted in the areas, if you will, that give rise to the competition in the first place. What is the test? And that would be, how do you make society successful? How do you make it possible for your citizenry to realize the things that people want? That is the competition that is important. And the problem, then, the challenge is to see to it that that as the United States and the Soviet Union meet in Europe, as we meet globally, that we do everything that we can to keep those differences from sharpening, from producing conflict. It's a long-term process, and the major accomplishment in 1985 was to lay out the agenda for a dialogue and to insist that it be more than arms control, to insist that it cover the whole range of concerns that are central to the American public when it looks at the relationship. This is perhaps not the right kind of a group to say of it, you would not generally be interested in arms control. Perhaps, in fact, you are. My own sense traveling around the United States is that for the American public, the words that capture the relationship and the problems of the relationship with the Soviet Union are human rights and Afghanistan. There's Sharansky and Southeast and Cambodia, that kind of combination, and not so very much, as one goes through this enormous land of ours, the size of particular missiles. And so for the U.S.-Soviet relationship to be founded, the dialogue to be founded securely in something that's realistic, it has to include arms control, human rights, regional issues, and of course the bilateral matters that come up between the two countries. We think that in 1985 we successfully created the framework, that broader framework for the dialogue. We also have put in place a process for the dialogue, the meeting of President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev, to be sure, with another summit in the United States and yet another in the Soviet Union, meetings of ministers on their part, cabinet secretaries on ours, meetings of executives and officials of all kinds of government agencies to keep this thing going. And if you're familiar with the joint statement, all the way down to trying to initiate for the first time the kinds of exchange programs that we have never had with the Soviet Union involving elementary and secondary school children, and offering, as if you will, an enticement, the willingness to work with the Soviet Union on computer education, computer software in the educational field. For 1986, the challenge is Summit 2. Someone said to me, you can't have two get-acquainted summits. What are you going to do at the second one? And it remains to be seen. We have not, as I said, established a date with the Soviet Union. We don't expect to be able to, in fact, until after the Party Congress. And so the next event on that U.S.-Soviet calendar has been, and starts tomorrow, the fourth round of the negotiations in Geneva on the defense and space questions, on START, the strategic talks, and of course the intermediate range missile talks that we're having with the Soviets. Again, poised, if you will, because until the dialogue reopens tomorrow, neither side will have a way of, if you will, measuring where the other one is at the present time on these matters. We're implementing the bilateral agreements we reached in Geneva on exchange programs, on the opening of consulates, on air safety. I didn't hear privately from Pan Am on this, but I did hear over the radio, television, that Pan Am and Aeroflot have now agreed on their program of flights for this coming summer. And we are trying to work out a schedule for the meeting of regional experts to get to this problem of regional conflicts. Maybe we won't solve them, but we are convinced it's far better to talk about each other's interests and perceptions in these various areas around the world than to stand around guessing, and worst of all, to make mistakes about the measurement of interest that the other side might have. I think it's fair to say that after the Geneva meetings, both President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev recognize that where there are differences, they're better understood, and where there are some shared concerns, maybe there's a better foundation for dealing with them. We'll just have to use 1986 to test those two propositions. It did open somewhat auspiciously with the two leaders exchanging television greetings. I describe a process of small steps, and some of you may think that's a mighty small step, but we have spent years saying to the Soviets that we thought it important to be able somehow to have access to their television. And we must at least take note of the fact that after Geneva there was an offer and there was an opportunity, and we quickly moved to take advantage of it, and the same then with General Secretary Gorbachev appearing on our television. Before moving on to the alliance, let me talk briefly about Eastern Europe, where history and circumstance have shaped each of these countries differently. And they also determine in large part, history and circumstance, what policies the countries of Eastern Europe are able to follow. The pattern of consultations with the alliance as we led up to Geneva was really quite remarkable. It was very close, it was continuing, it was at all levels. It included most visibly the President, perhaps secondarily most visibly the Secretary of State. But there were many people going back and forth across the Atlantic to share views, to share ideas, to give progress reports, and it went very well. And I think we will be seeing more of that. I know we will be seeing more of that in 1986, but it has been the demonstration of what alliance is all about. This isn't to say that we aren't faced with problems that could very well throw it off stride and bring basic policies under pressure, but there is a high degree of consensus, and there certainly is strong Allied support for the negotiating position in Geneva. I should, of course, mention the Strategic Defense Initiative. People are looking at it in the longer term, and allies are deciding for themselves whether they wish to participate in it or not, and if so, how, and if not, it's not been an alliance issue. The Dutch decision on deploying cruise missiles, an extremely difficult political decision. The earlier Belgian decision, the same, all in the name of providing the necessary evidence of alliance solidarity and alliance willingness to make political as well as military investments in the process of dealing with the Soviet Union. We're a continuation of the record of Allied unity all through the years since the 1979 dual-track decision. We have seen, I think observers would agree on this without exception, we have seen in the past months a far more energetic Soviet leadership, a far more energetic arms control, public diplomacy by the Soviet Union, and we have seen that it simply has not thrown the Allied governments off stride. I think this has been true as well for the public in those countries, and most have not at all been fooled by the various formulations and the like put out. But the challenge for '86 is to hang on to that present cohesion, particularly on arms control strategy and our negotiating positions. But there are going to be other topics that come up, and one is before us right now, and that's the subject of international terrorism. And I suppose that nowhere are the requirements for consultation and for working with the right to have a different point of view more relevant than these days when we are trying to generate an appreciation of the challenge to all of us by international terrorism and to find ways of cooperating. There does exist a general desire to cooperate. We do have good cooperation and good links among police and intelligence services, but we have not yet found the way to act together in response either to the long-term challenge or indeed to the immediate challenge of Libya. The evening news probably reported the departure today of the Deputy Secretary of State, John Whitehead, on a presidential mission to Canada and a number of European capitals. He isn't going out to keep a scorecard saying, this person does this and that person does that. He's really going out to discuss broadly and deeply with countries that share our interest in this, who are sharing the awful things that are happening, to discuss, first of all, the Libyan support for international terrorism, including the most recent attacks. He's going to be consulting with them about and informing them about, in more detail, about our economic sanctions against Libya as announced by the President on January 7th. And he's going to be encouraging these governments to take concrete steps to respond to the threat posed by Libya and the international terrorist threat. It's going to be a long-term effort. We want to develop at the political level with like-minded governments a broad consensus on attitudes and overall policies likely to deter terrorism. We're convinced that acting together will have a greater impact. As you well know, we have said, on the other hand, our actions to date reflect our own interest and our own determination to take steps that we believe are necessary. We would like to have that broader support, and we're going to go out and try to get it. That will perhaps be one of the most difficult and challenging issues in that setting of, say, quality friends that I mentioned at the beginning. And people will be looking at the value of the relationship in terms of responses to that. I would invite you to be careful to not decry the value of alliance or the value of close ties by what happens on one issue where there are so many different points of view and so many interests that need, in fact, working out over a longer term than we have had in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Let me then turn, I don't want to take all of his time talking myself, let me turn to a relationship that is altogether too often forgotten, and that's with Canada. Although I do know when I go to Ottawa, I have to come up here to BWI to catch the airplane to Ottawa, so perhaps you have a better perspective than my colleagues in Washington would have were I giving the speech there. There is another summit on the 1986 calendar. It's the summit March 18th in Washington between the President and Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney. I stepped back at the beginning to talk about a few things, that broad words like democracy and the rest that relate us to Europe and North America generally. Let me do the same thing for just a moment with Canada, because I think it is at least worth saying for the record and reminding everyone that that is the most intensive and extensive foreign association that we have. And we often forget it. I mean, it is simply looked at again as lumber problems, fishing problems, perhaps in the baseball season, other kinds of problems, but we forget these fundamental bonds that exist with Canada, and with the fact that with no other nation in the world do we share as closely these cultural and political social values that I was referring to at the beginning about in the shaping of our lives. And so I think we ought not to forget that as we go on to say that we have challenges in this relationship as well. Certainly for Canada, they know that American policies always have a profound effect on them. They focus a great deal of attention on what's happening in Washington and even in our state capitals. One of the problems on the agenda of the Bureau of European and Canadian Affairs when I took over in the summer was a very serious problem involving actions by the Dakotas in some agricultural fields. And that deeper relationship is one then that can be very sustaining, but does give rise to unusual problems. We also have a more widely diffused foreign policy view, and this has led on occasion to a perception among Canadians and sometimes with the Canadian government that the United States isn't paying enough attention to its northern neighbor. We've done quite a bit to try to give the lie to that. The President's first trip outside the country was to Ottawa, And we have developed a very busy program of exchange, of counterparts throughout the government with the Canadians. It's also worth doing a little bit of that stepping back on the political nature of the relationship with the European community. I'm leading into a brief discussion before we close here of trade issues, both with Canada and the European community, and before doing so, I've given you a bit of an underlining on the importance of remembering how important the Canadian relationship is. I'd like to do the same thing on the question of the United States and something called a united Europe. And we have to step back from the aggravations of trade disputes to recall and to remember, and I think to continue to find valid the vision. Sometimes these days we're embarrassed about having, a vision of a relationship, but we did have a vision of a relationship with Europe that's guided our policy since World War II, and I think remains valid and guides it still, ought to guide it still. President Reagan said last May in Strasbourg, "I'm here to tell you that America remains as she was 40 years ago, dedicated to the unity of Europe. We continue to see a strong and unified Europe not as a rival, but as an even stronger partner." And what's happening in Europe today, it continues to grow as something European. We are welcoming the entrance of Spain and Portugal into the European community. And certainly their presence is good for them and makes for a stronger Europe, and a stronger Europe is a stronger West. Now, on to trade, because I find that my day very often begins with trying to live the wish that I have expressed here, that one could think broadly, and ends with telling people why the United States believes as it does about citrus, walnuts, pasta, a summertime on footwear, issues that reach down into the communities of the United States and have a very real political life, and which must be taken seriously not only by the United States but by our trading partners. The administration is committed to expanding, not contracting, world trade and economic efficiency. I guess here in Baltimore, and certainly in this location, I can use the phrase that's well known, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And in this case, that's the basic view on trade. Expanding trade leads to growth, and protectionism can breed stagnation. So we would like to have new trade negotiations. We would like to have the expeditious settlement of trade disputes. We want significant trade grievances with our trading partners handled as quickly as possible, but we want them settled. Another phrase that you will hear, it's very common these days, in talking about the trade relationships around the world, we're prepared to deal in the market, we're prepared to accept the consequences of more open trading, but we want what people are calling the more level playing field, the playing field that's the same for both teams. In Canada, perhaps the most significant thing taking place in the relationship today is in the area of trade. We're about ready to start on a major initiative with Ottawa to expand what is already the world's largest trading relationship, $120 billion in 1984. U.S. exports to Canada, $50 billion. Imports from Canada, $70 billion. U.S. investment in Canada, over $50 billion, and Canadians with over $11 billion invested in the United States. The President notified Congress on December 10th of the administration's intent to enter into negotiations of a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with Canada. We think this kind of an agreement has the potential for clearing away a lot of brush and undergrowth, restrictive nature that can be found in the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship. This is in tariff as well as non-tariff barriers. Obviously, we want to maximize our exports, and we want to reach some understandings on services, on subsidies, on investment policy, and things of that sort. We would expect to begin these negotiations in May or June, but this, of course, requires first, excuse me, the completion of a statutory period for initial congressional review. But it should be completed about that time, and assuming that it is received positively in the course of that review, then it would be in May or June. It's the kind of a program that will require continuous consultation with Congress and the private sector. It's going to be not a 1 or 2 month affair at all. It's going to take quite some time to get into the details of a relationship as vast as ours with Canada. The trade with the EC is not much less than that of Canada. There's $106 billion in 1984 and $113 billion in 1985. And when Spain and Portugal now are in the EC, we may find that in 1986 those figures will take over the figures with Canada, and the European community will become our largest trading partner. Certainly the entry of Spain and Portugal on January 1 greatly expands the potential mutual benefits of EC membership, but it's certainly also going to require some very careful adjustments, and it certainly is going to be of importance to the United States as the European community makes those adjustments in the agricultural field. The occasional visits that I make to some of the Hill subcommittees concerned, the congressional subcommittees concerned with this part of the world, always find me answering questions: what will be the impact in the United States in the area of feed grains, soybeans, corn glutens, things of that sort, of the addition of Spain and Portugal to the community. And we must have the kind of a dialogue in which we all share the price of bringing Spain and Portugal into the community as we enjoy the benefit of this broader European relationship and the help that it gives to Spain and Portugal. The persistence of trade conflicts with the European community, I find at least, has a capacity to be erosive of the broader Atlantic relationship that I was talking about as I began my remarks. And so one has to become accustomed to the disputes. There are going to be rough edges in anything as vast as this, but at the same time we must insist that the disputes be resolved fairly and expeditiously, and that they not hang around to cause even greater problems than they already represent, and that they be solved, as I say, with fairness, that we not be asked constantly to pay the price of the investment in the broader relationship. So, to leave time for questions, I think I will end my discussion of these selected themes at this point, and do my best perhaps with whatever questions you'd like to ask. I'd just like to end by going back to those broad thoughts of what we're all about in the relationship, and suggest as we, some 40 years after describing those relationships, not be embarrassed to say what they were all about, and continue to be all about. Associations of states that share values. Yes, we occupy different places in the world. Some are closer to problems than we're closer to other problems. We are a superpower. We have a U.S.-Soviet relationship to manage. We have a relationship with Canada in which we must pay particular attention to the impact our decisions have. But altogether, we have quality friends, we have tough issues, we aren't always going to agree, but we are in very good shape to address not only the threats to our own societies in such fields as terrorism, but I think we're in very good shape to take advantage of what is now the reopened dialogue with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets are willing to be serious and substantive in that dialogue, perhaps to address some of these broad problems with the Soviets that fall in the areas of arms control, human rights, regional issues, and other bilateral activities. those would be my remarks. Thank you very much for having me up here.
Would you care to comment on the observation that Mr. Crocker could have visited slums in the United States as well as in South Africa?
Undoubtedly, but Mr. Crocker is the Assistant Secretary in charge of policy for Africa, and I think we ought to applaud his energy in getting out from capital cities and government buildings and out to where the problems are.
Would you comment on our allies' reaction to the report that President Reagan approved a plan to destabilize the Libyan government?
Well, I don't know the report, and I certainly don't know of any such plan. But allies' comments all of the time, the comments I have seen from allied governments have been in response to the President's formal statement of the other evening, in which he laid out a series of steps which the United States was going to take in pursuance of our own evaluation of what ought to be done and our own desire to reduce our ties with the Libyan government. And there have been various responses. Some have said they don't think they want to go that way. Others, Canada has said it would like to talk more to us about them. Several of the governments have already asked their industries at least not to fill in behind us, which the President has underlined, as has Secretary Schultz, of something that if you're not going to go along with us for whatever reasons those are, and we think you're wrong not to go along with us, then don't fill in behind us. We are hearing from countries that they will act that way. We are seeing in Europe now Norway was the most recent, a small country, but an influential country, saying that it believes something ought to be done. So I think you have to look at both sides of both stages of the challenge. We may find that with respect to the particular steps we have taken, that we will not have the Europeans following us precisely. But we are finding, I think in a rather significant measure, a desire to sit down and talk about what we can do. It's not going to satisfy, I think, the American public. There's a very real sense here, as we feel it, that something, by golly, has got to be done. But other governments are also responsive to their publics, and I think that there would be more and more attention paid to this. Another little interesting factor, these are informal figures, but I saw them the other day, something like $1 billion in tourism has been lost in Europe. That can be assigned to the question of people changing their travel plans. That begins to change where your interests are, if enough of that kind of readjustment of patterns takes place. So I think I would not expect anyone to be pleased with my language today, which is probably rounder than you would use on the European reaction. But I think you would find that over a period of time, it is inescapable that Europe and European countries will begin to see they have to act. And we want to make sure that they know through this mission with John Whitehead that they know we're willing to cooperate, and we urge them to treat this problem with as much haste and attention as we think it needs.
Does the reaction of our allies to our policy actions with respect to Libya and Syria tend to discredit or contradict your assertion that the alliance has never been stronger?
It might seem that way to some, but I hope I gave myself the basis for an answer in my own remarks. The alliance, that is NATO, the security alliance that crosses the Atlantic, that is the foundation for our security posture, I believe globally, because it's at the heart of what challenges us globally. The machinery of that alliance, of the military relationship, the dialogue and the consultative process that give us support in the talks with the Soviet Union in Geneva, that same dialogue and process that made it possible for us, for the President, for the Secretary and others to hear the views of Europe before we went to the Soviet Union, to engage them in dialogue and lead to Geneva. That whole set of machinery, that process has never been in better shape nor more effectively used. And I think that we see coming from it, as we saw after Geneva, a Europe in which I certainly measured, and others traveling in Europe might have felt the same way, a very real sense of an American leadership which was responsible and responsive to European concerns as they are involved in the East-West relationship. And that's where I think you can say without question that the alliance is more confident on both sides of the Atlantic, in better shape than it's been in the last 2 decades. The challenge of terrorism is the one to find a way of cooperating which is equally effective. It is not possible, as I think I said earlier, to ask institutions to keep taking on tasks for which they were not designed. And so it shouldn't be a test of the health of the NATO alliance as to whether or not there is unified European and immediate European response to what the United States is doing in the field of international terrorism. It is fair, as your question suggests, to ask if we're all in this together and we're all paying the price for terrorism, why can't we agree on some measures? And to be more than disappointed that we haven't been able to find those measures. But I would not mix the two up, because we have two sets of interests. Yes, they are related because they're taking place in the same Atlantic world and they're challenging the same states. But I think it's very dangerous to mix the two up and announce that NATO, the alliance, the military posture, the confidence in the arms control negotiations somehow ought to be given a lower mark because of what's happening on terrorism. Terrorism, I think we're going to have to find a way to cooperate just as well. Consultations, you mentioned, the failure to consult. It's always difficult for the United States, which has its own U.S. interests, which has its own public requirements, has its own responsibilities to its citizens in certain kinds of areas, to say this process is going to be, this international or national process is going to be slowed down and is going to wait for others to join on. There is on every issue a set of choices as to what is the pace you proceed alone, how do you adjust that pace while you wait for others. On this one, it's very clear we believed that given what happened in Rome and Vienna, the information that was available, we had to act. And it is true, we did not go out ahead of time and seek broad support. And that is what we're trying to do now. And it's also another reason why we're also saying let's also look at the long term. That's by far too lengthy an answer for that, but I think it's important to keep them separate.
Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the observation that American recent policy reaction might be to the withdrawal of Libyan funds from the United States and not to their support of terrorism?
Well, I think that's putting it a little too simply. We had not, in the original statement of the President, had not frozen assets. But we knew with many things happening between now and February 1, which is the final coming into force date of all of these various steps, that we had to find some way to help our industry and people over there who are trying to clean things up and leave in an orderly fashion. And when it became apparent that funds were going to move, as I've been told was the case, I was not a part of that decision and wouldn't be the expert on it, that as funds started to move, it was necessary to preserve, if you will, the balance between what was here and what was over there, as our countries were trying to leave in an orderly fashion. Companies were trying to leave.
Would you comment on the extent to which European dependence on oil is a serious determinant of their policy?
I don't have the exact figures, but I'm sure that it is too broad and could be misleading to say European dependence on Libyan oil, because the situation clearly is not the same from one country to the next. There are those that might depend on Libyan oil, and there are those that do not. There are other countries that have large populations in Libya. I'm told the total figure is something 60, 70,000 Europeans in Libya. There are others who have none of those interests, but are not convinced, as they have said over the years, that sanctions do anything. And so you have a variety of views, and it's to separate those out and to not and to start saying, not that the tourism loss figures will be persuasive, but we think they'll certainly get their attention. And to start saying, let's sit down and ask precisely, what are these interests? We keep saying it is oil, we keep saying it is people, we keep saying, or we keep hearing, for example, that there is a concern that perhaps the play-out of terrorism will be in Europe, and so they want to know what risks they are taking for further steps against them. We hear that Europeans have closer Mediterranean ties, closer Middle Eastern ties, have longer traditions in the region. Well, it's time to say, fine, we hear all of that. Now what's the old phrase, let's parse some of that and see if we can't pull out of it some things that might possibly be done as a first step.
Do we have an Office of U.S. Terrorism with, in being with direct contact with the President? With the Chief of Staff, and therefore the President, I would hope. Yes. But that's not necessarily true, is it?
There are several locales around of people who specialize in these things. I honestly do not know. I am aware of the study that has been done on how we might organize ourselves to combat terrorism. I'm aware of what we are doing certainly in the Department of State, where we now have an Office for the Combating of Terrorism, which is the focal point for political cooperation to the extent that it exists, and trying to foster political cooperation in aviation security fields, things of that sort. But I simply do not know myself what the organization chart would show with respect to a particular office or unit reporting to Chief of
So
Staff.
as of right now, we have a here, and here, but nothing one.
I can't answer that. I wouldn't want to say yes and have you say, terrific, it's about time, or say no and have you say, by golly, why not? Because I simply don't know.
To what extent is an ideological hardening within American foreign policy evident to you within European and Canadian relations?
There's no reason for you to know a great deal about my career, but there are those who would argue that I am a quintessential pragmatist and therefore wouldn't know an ideology if I saw one. And some people find that recommending, and others find that disqualifying. And I'm torn as I hear your question as to which view I might give support to. I do not find ideological hardening as I sense you using the term. I do see, as I have done myself this evening, a determination as we go issue by issue across the international agenda to keep fundamental principles in front of us, to keep reminding ourselves what is it the United States stands for. What is it the Americans think they stand for? What is it that Americans want to stand for? And how does that play out into government policy? What are the principles that we said that we were going to start to give life to when we organized in Europe at the end of the war? And I find, even for myself, as I go through a day of the issues of the walnuts and citrus and the like, or 6 months of it, that you can lose sight of what it was we started out to do. And you can lose sight also of the globe. You begin to get one of those exaggerated maps that I'm a Midwesterner. I have seen Easterners have, where there's nothing after New York except, you know, Philadelphia, where Chicago is supposed to be, and then out to Hawaii, and they don't understand the globe. They don't understand their universe. So I think that there has one of the themes of this administration has frankly been, of both terms, to step back a bit and to restate the general principles. Whether one agrees with them or not, I think that has been the effort, to step back and restate the general principles. The relationship with the Soviet Union was announced when the administration began. We will start, I think the three words were realism, strength, and dialogue. Readjust the way we appreciate the Soviet Union, and then find a leader to talk to. Rebuild your strength, and then open the dialogue. And it's right on program, and I don't find any more or less ideology in that, just a very real conviction as to how you ought to proceed. There is, if there is ideology in that, there is as much in the relationship with Canada. Because it too is, as I tried to say, a relationship with the neighbor with whom we share so many fundamental things. I don't find that ideological hardening, but as I said, there are people who would say I wouldn't know an ideology if I saw one. I think I do see one, and I think that it is being pursued. I think it's being pursued as the administration wants to pursue it, but not with any more or less hardening. I think it's been consistent.
Do you think that perhaps Great Britain is being less of a friend with respect to our policy in Libya than we were with respect to the Falkland Islands?
I really didn't hear a question in that. I heard a very common view that Americans are expressing as they watch on this issue. I have no judgment to make on it because it is very real, and this is how people believe. I mean, this is not an unusual statement, and I think that the sense in the American public today that something must be done is sooner or later going to be joined by European publics. I mean, those were not only Americans in the airport in Vienna and Rome, and they weren't only Americans. We pay the price perhaps more than others do, but those were not only Americans on the Achille Lauro, and they aren't only Americans on Egyptian airliners and things of that sort. And sooner or later there's going to be a European view, I'm convinced, as strong as the American public feels right now in exactly the terms that you just used.
Would you comment upon the Russians' reaction to terrorism, and first of all, and secondly, can you solve the problem simply by singling out Libya?
You cannot solve the problem that is known as international terrorism by suggesting that it is the current problem with Libya. It is far broader than that, but you must start somewhere, and you soon reach a level at which you feel that you must act, and that is exactly how we have proceeded. We believe that we must act. If others join us, fine, but if they don't, we believe something must be done. On the question of the Soviet Union, you could go around the world, and you could go throughout the U.S.-Soviet relationship, and you could lay out reasons for not dealing with the Soviet Union. We start with Sharansky, Sakharov, their posture in Eastern Europe, Afghanistan, their unwillingness to negotiate so far in a meaningful fashion on certain kinds of issues, South Asia, whatever. And you could say those are all good reasons for not dealing with them, and the result of that is that you would not have any kind of a relationship with the Soviet Union. I believe if you look at the globe, and we're going to occupy the globe with somebody that's got the other half, you ought to be able to have a dialogue. You should not assume that that fact of the dialogue is going to solve the problems. You shouldn't kid yourself that differences wish themselves away just because you're talking. But I am one of the people who would believe